All right, to take a look at our sample, first we're going to take a spoonful, we're going to put it into the sample tray. Then we're going to take the tray, place it in the center, and secure it with the metal clasps. Then make any adjustments we need to the microscope using the dials on either side. We're going to take our light, turn it on, and center it on the tray. So looking through, we can take our utensil here, look through, and we can pick at pieces. Get a closer look.
Our first sample is from Honeymoon Island on Florida's west coast. Here you can see we have quite a bit of quartz and shell fragments, both large and small. Some of them are shell, some of them look like they came from possibly a coral reef, and something here looks like it's definitely carbonate, but might not just be a shell piece, it might be something from a planktonic organism. If you take a look at the sorting, you can see that the quartz portion is fairly well sorted, mostly around the same grain size, but we have some larger pieces mixed in at a fairly high percentage, so we wouldn't call that entire sample well sorted. It's a fairly poorly sorted sediment. We can go ahead and zoom in to this area to check out this feature a little bit more. Take a look at the detail on this particular particle. This does not look like a regular shell, does it? It looks more like the carapace of a planktonic creature. You'll know which one by the time you look at your notes. Here also you can note there's a bit of garnet here. Comes from our granitic source, the same place that the quartz came in from. There's more quartz here than there is garnet because quartz is more stable in the original granite, and so there'll be fewer garnet pieces here. The more quartz in a sample, the more mature the sediment. Here also you'll see some dark particles. Not sure we can zoom in close enough to determine whether those are phosphatic or heavy minerals. Let's look at another portion of this sample. Little closer by, these features are brown, but look at the texture of them. Looks to me like those are pieces of wood, basic detritus that is associated with a coastal environment or an area that was near that coast and material that got washed in. Another piece of garnet here, and here we have another bit. Because of the morphology of this, we cannot fully determine whether that is phosphate or heavy minerals. But something like this that is so angular is most likely heavy mineral, as is this piece right here. Going to the next slide, use your ruler. These are marked out in millimeters to get a measurement of your grain sizes so that you can determine how you would categorize the grain size of these sediments. Remember, larger grain sizes usually indicate higher energy environments. Sample 2 is from Casperson Beach on Florida's west coast, down near Venice. You can see there's a little bit more variety going on in this one, but that the grain sizes are closer together. This one is a more well-sorted sample than the previous. Several components can be seen here. Plenty of quartz, of course. This sort of feature right here, I do not believe is to be a heavy mineral. Stuff that's shiny like this is more often phosphatic grains. When you measure these grains, you can see that overall, this particular sediment sample is coarser than the previous. Though better sorted, the pieces themselves on average are larger. There are garnets evident, as well as phosphate, and plenty of quartz. Zooming in a little bit, you can see some detail on these larger grains. This looks like a piece of tiger's eye, doesn't it? Something you might wear on a necklace. This would be a garnet as well. And what do you think this is? Another picture of garnet with some pretty shiny phosphate. This one has some interesting color as well. We'd have to look at that one closer to determine its source. You can see that there's some bits of shell fragments here, but the vast majority of it does not appear to be carbonate. You can use your ruler again in the zoomed in view to get a better measurement on these smaller fragments. Sample 3A is from Cocoa Beach, actually from a summer beach profile. Take a look at the sample overall. It has a smaller percentage of phosphate and heavy minerals than the previous, And you can see it is also fairly well sorted. Lots of quartz here. Some dark gray and black might be some phosphatic grains, but you can see some evidence of its Appalachian source. Note that there's also a smaller percentage of shell fragments in this sample. Use your ruler to get an idea of overall grain size, and then look at some of the detailed portions. We're going to zoom in right here. Take a look at this particular grain. It really does look like a small piece of granite because that's exactly what it is. When you look at the patterning and the colors, looks like a piece of granite you might see on a sidewalk or in a building somewhere. Take a look and get a good measurement of it. This might also be a piece of granite that came in. And what do you think these orange pieces might be? Look at this guy we found in the sample. That definitely looks like signs of life. What sort of creature do you think might have been the source of this particular feature? Get a measurement of it and give me a good description. Sample 3B is also from Cocoa Beach, but from the winter berm, a different part of the beach at a different time of season. What a difference. Because of wind erosion, the smaller particles get winnowed away, and take a look at all the shells that are evident in this particular sample. Get a good measurement so you can identify grain sizes and note the sorting. The biggest thing to note here is the angularity of these particles. Particles that have been worked by water extensively get rounded, right? If something's bouncing around, anything that's a edge is going to get hit, knocked off, broken down, etc. Here you can see that not very much of that has happened here. Lots of pointy edges, many angles, which means this is not a very mature sediment. Some nice shell fragments that you can zero in on. Of course, there are quartz portions here, but definitely less evidence of fines. Ruler here for your measurements. And a little bit closer view. Note again the angularity of these particles. Lots of evidence of shells, evidence of things that might have been from a granitic source, but they definitely have not been worked for very long. Mostly this is evidence of berm, where wind erosion has taken away fines, but it has not been in a high energy aqueous environment for long. Use your ruler again to get a good measurement of grain size. That's an interesting angle, isn't it? Notice that sometimes things that you just saw in plan section look very different in cross section. You have to consider the angle at which you're viewing particles before you make an identification. Sample 3C is from Jensen Beach, closer to Fort Lauderdale on Florida's east coast. If you take a look here, you can see that the particles are a little bit more rounded. There's some chert in here, as well as plenty of quartz. What do you think about how well sorted this sample is? I would say it's a little more than one of our previous samples, but a little less than others as well. Overall, if you take a measurement, you can see that the particles are a little coarser than those found on Honeymoon Island. So that means that this is a higher energy environment. There isn't a direct measurement to be taken to say this was high energy versus low energy necessarily, unless of course you're getting into the fines such as silts and muds. It's all a relative measure, but if one tends to have larger grains than the other, we can assume that one was a higher energy environment. Material on this beach is replenished. It's actually taken from pumping from offshore bars and brought back to the beach. Let's zoom in. Look at that perfectly preserved plankton. Get a measurement on it so you can see its grain size. Other particles you can see. Take a look at them and see what you think their source might be. Note the level of angularity and roundedness. Here's some pretty features. This guy here, because it is shiny, some folks might think it is phosphatic coated grains. Another thought might be because of the texture you can see that it's a piece of granite. I would assume this piece that's shinier like that is a phosphatic grain or a heavy mineral. Take your measurements Sample 4 is from Andros Island in the Bahamas. Taking a look at the sample overall, immediately you note the absence of quartz material. The source of this sediment is no longer from the Appalachians that have been washed down the beach towards Florida. These are built from carbonate banks, and you can notice that the vast majority of this material is from a carbonate source. Chunks like this look like they came off of a coral reef, actual shells of course, and there are several discs that indicate some sort of life evidence. Let's take a closer look. Get your measurements so you can get an idea of grain size, and what would you think of sorting on this particular sample? Overall, they're pretty large chunks, so though they aren't within a 1/4 millimeter of each other, there certainly isn't a large disparity like the sample we saw that had shell fragments amongst quartz grains. Taking a closer look, you can see evidence of life. We have evidence of planktonic life, and we have some halometa discs that are green algae. In some of these samples, you can also see spicules. Also, take a look up here in the corner. Look at this beautiful spiral shape. That is definitely a brachiopod or a snail sort of creature. Get a good measurement. When you see something jagged like this, what does it make you think of? Do you think it's a remnant of a regular shell, or maybe a collection of shells, or maybe it came from a coral reef? Obviously a regular shell here. Chunks like this are usually something that was tumbled off of a reef or a carbonate bank. This, of course, is a shell. Sometimes you have to think about whether you're looking at it straight on or in cross section to determine whether this is a bivalve or a brachiopod. Bivalves, of course, have 2 shells like clams, and brachiopods have the spiral shells like snails. Sample 5 is from Nassau Island in the Bahamas. Taking a look at it, you can see that it's a lot of the same material as the previous sample, mostly carbonate, but definitely more broken down, more weathered, which means it is a more mature sediment. It has been exposed to a higher energy that broke up those shells. We're going to zoom in right here. What do you think this feature is? What do you think its source might be? You can see plenty of carbonate material, fairly well sorting, and these pink guys right here are often foraminifera. Zooming into another feature, what sort of remnant do you think this is? Was it broken off of a reef? Is it part of a shell? Or does it also represent a planktonic species? Use your ruler again to get an idea of grain size so that you can estimate energy of the environment. Sample 6 is also from the Bahamas and is provided just for fun. This is a picture of ooids. These are also made out on the carbonate bank near Bahamas, but they are not necessarily the remnants of shells, at least not directly. The area near the Bahamas gets so saturated with carbonates that it precipitates out of solution. So when it gets oversaturated, it will precipitate out, and it actually precipitates out in these little balls, and it is done in layers. So if you were to cut one of these in half, it would look like a jawbreaker. When there's not enough carbonate in the system, it'll go back into solution in the water. When there's too much, it'll precipitate right out. These ooids can flow together in features called whitings, and whitings can be seen from space. Take a look to get grain size. Pretty darn well sorted sample here. Of course, there's a few remnants of shell materials or something broken off a bank, but the vast majority of these were precipitated directly from the seawater. These may look like they're well rounded because they were worked from a beach, but these ones are rounded so perfectly because they were precipitated out, and they simply nucleated the precipitate around an existing particle, layer upon layer.